Hey everybody, I'm Sasha White.
And I'm Nesim Vatani, and this is The Underground. We're going to be speaking with Arty Morty today.
So yeah, we have Arty Morty on, and we are going to be putting up the first half of the episode publicly on YouTube. And then if you want to catch the second half of our conversation where things got a little bit wild, you can head on over to the Plebity Patreon and become a member there and see the rest of our episode.
Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah. We were like, this is the person we wanted to, you're our first guest on our show on The Underground. So yeah, we really wanted to get to talk to you. And Nesim has been really wanting to talk to you for a while.
Yeah, we haven't met. It's great to meet you finally.
It's great to meet you. I've enjoyed your podcast on YouTube.
Oh, I'm glad to say that.
Yeah, I love how you do I watched the one about gay culture that you did. You're talking about transgender, and you were talking about how it was not the same as the gay rights movement. And then you were going into the history of the gay rights movement. You even went into the history of the dark side, and then how it purged itself and all that. And it was really interesting. I learned a lot from it. So I was like, oh, yeah, I want to talk to him.
Oh, that's great. I really like to emphasize that the gay rights movement had a dark side that we had to work through. There had to be open debate to make the movement stronger and to fix the problems, because I think that's a really good analogy to what's going on. I don't think we should be making too many comparisons between trans and gay, but since people are already doing so, and those are the people we're often sort of at odds against, I think it's a powerful rhetorical tool to say, okay, if you want to compare trans rights to the gay rights movement, look at what the gay rights movement had to do in order to achieve its goals. Why don't you try doing that too?
It seems like
open yourself to debate.
Yeah, it seems like people have forgotten that if you don't look within your own and see what they're saying, that the movement can go and veer off to some of the most darkest. Because I'm a big follower of the Palestinian movement, and you have to go through that and kick out the anti-Semites.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
Because you will get people coming in being like, yeah, I'm all for this, and then you find out that they are like, I really hate Jews, and you're just like, okay, you need to go over there and leave us alone.
It's like we're criticizing Israel, and someone's just like, yeah, and the Jews, they run everything too, and we're like, oh, hang on a second with that.
Yeah, it's like all of a sudden they start going in. Yeah, crazy stuff. You're like, all right, get out.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the first things that we wanted to talk to you about is kind of the entrenchment of identity, like how identities have become, or certain identities have become like all encompassing, like with being gay or with being trans or being a woman even, like this defines you in every way. And kind of, we wanted to hear your thoughts on what that's done to the culture, what that's done to the left. And yeah, we kind of want to start with that.
Oh gosh, well, it's so strange because people have attributes about themselves that are so important, but identities are really stories that we tell about ourselves to make sense of ourselves and to make sense of our lives and to put ourselves in context. An identity is a story you tell about yourself, ultimately. It may be rooted in facts about you, but an identity is a way you talk about yourself, essentially. Like homosexuality is not really an identity, but when you're saying you identify first and foremost as a gay person, you're telling a story about yourself. You're saying you could be perhaps not a particularly oppressed gay person. You could be a very comfortable gay person in a liberal, progressive city who's never faced homophobia, but you might be identifying as an oppressed minority, even though you haven't faced any particular hardship in your life. Your life story hasn't actually encountered very much homophobia, but your identity tells you that you're supposed to be feeling as though you have experienced a lot of it.
So I've got a question about this. How do you think, how do you feel about the way it's gone? Because from what I've seen, I've paid attention to the gay rights movement ever since I was young, because I mean, my sister had a lot of gay friends. And so it was something that I've grown up, at least watching. It feels like to me that it has, instead of creating an environment of bringing people in, it feels like many, at least in the United States, it's otherized. It has not brought people in at all. People who are gay are still otherized in the culture. And like this attempt of inclusion seems to be even more otherizing than anything else. What do you think?
Well, it's hard to say because it's really, I guess it's a regional thing, how comfortable you feel within your culture. Like my extended family is in the south of the United States and they're brutally homophobic. So there's just tremendous homophobia in many parts of North America, even still. But where I am, it's just, I just don't experience any homophobia at all. You know, it's just none whatsoever. The last time I experienced anything that I considered to be really homophobic is when I went into the States years ago for a vacation. You know,
where did you
and I was in
visit?
Ohio or something, and I went to an amusement park, and somebody called me a faggot. And then later that night in downtown Cleveland, somebody called me a faggot again, and that was the extent of it. You know.
Yeah. The reason why I brought this up is because, like, if you go and you watch like the argument of representation for like in movies and stuff like that, you never have a gay character without them basically flaunting their sexuality. Like a heterosexual character, you don't ever have to even get into their romantic life.
Yeah.
But a gay character, you must get into their romantic life. You must know who they want to be with. And it's like, it's almost like you're expected to be like, it's almost like the context is that to be this, you have to almost have like a voyeuristic life where people can see into the privacy.
Well, there's something very difficult about gay representation in film because homosexuality is invisible.
Exactly.
You can't just be, I talked about on a podcast before about how there wasn't enough gay representation of just garden variety gay people, a gay bus driver or whatever. But within that limited amount of time, I couldn't really go into the fact that there could be lots of gay bus drivers on television. Because how would you know that the bus driver is gay unless you get into some storyline about their private life, you know? I think a good example of a sort of subtle inclusion was in the reboot of the Star Trek series, where the Sulu character, you just see him sort of kissing his husband and baby goodbye as he boards the Starship Enterprise. And that's just a quick, like, okay, he's gay. You know, we're not going to make a big storyline out of it. It's just a passing, a reasonable inclusion of his family because he's kissing his family goodbye to board a spaceship. You know?
It reminds me of the Harry Potter Dumbledore thing because J.K. Rowling said, "Oh well, yeah, Dumbledore was gay," but you know that was never explicitly said in the series. So a lot of the people on Twitter or whoever like completely came after her and said, "Oh, you're just saying that now to get inclusion points, but you should have actually written in that he was gay." But I thought at the time, like, well, that's nice that he was just gay, but you never had to really talk about it. That was just a small thing about him. That was just one small thing about him.
Yeah. Well, to go back to the question, there's a push and a pull there because on the one hand, you don't want to treat it like it's nothing. Like gay characters want gay stories. We want, you know, we want our lives, which are different in fundamental ways from straight people's lives. Sometimes we're not just straight people who happen to be gay. There really is a difference in a lot of our lives. We want to see that represented. We want to see gay stories. But on the other hand, we also want to be treated like, like we want to incorporate and integrate into society at the same time. We're seeing really this crisis starting to boil on the gay issue specifically, as we are starting to integrate. We're starting to realize that we're losing our sense of identity because it's becoming less of a big deal. So like gay villages are collapsing, gay bars, because nobody identifies, or fewer people in liberal progressive cities like I'm in, identify primarily as gay because there's no reason to. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, the acceptance.
Yeah, but then you realize you're losing a lot when you lose that. It's almost like when you're an immigrant and you have your culture that you came from and you bring it into Canada, say, and you're becoming a Canadian and you don't want to necessarily like live within the enclave where all the other immigrants from that country live. But then when you leave it, you realize you're missing parts of your culture and you want to have a place where you can go and still have, you know, still revisit that culture. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. See, I can say as an Arab and a Muslim, like I dread movies that are made about us. Whether they're like, when I heard Marvel was going to make a Muslim superhero, I thought, oh my God, just think about how like crazy it's going to be. They're going to make him so nauseatingly like good. And then like, what experience are you representing? Because they're going to try to like do this generalized experience when people have very specific experiences many times.
Yeah, is
So
he going to be Shia or Sunni? Like, what's going
yeah,
on?
exactly. Is it going to be Shia, Sunni? And you know, what is it? What did he come from? A accepting place? Because I mean, I came from Virginia. You know, I'm raised in this place, and when I was growing up, it was during the Iraq War One. So it was not the nicest of places. Like I can tell you right now, like I remember at my school, there was two things. I was the only Arab Muslim kid at the school. And it was a very brutal school. It was a Southern school. And like the culture was like, I still remember one guy getting found out that he was gay and they went for him. Like the kids wanted to beat him up.
Yeah,
I would get it, and I had to be I had to be violent in order to, you know, not be the victim of it, you know. So I mean, the experiences are gonna change, and I don't know. I feel like many ways the whole inclusion turns to like a form of like liberal pandering, where they turn us into almost like one-dimensional characters. We're only in the stories only defined by like religion or our sexuality or, you know, so forth. I don't see them portraying like either gay or Muslims or any minorities. I see them always making almost like caricatures than anything else. There's very little nuance.
I think I've heard discussion once about how some people wonder if that's sort of a necessary first step in Hollywood with representation, that there's no representation and then minority groups are fighting for representation. And the first kinds of representation they get in the Hollywood model is these very stereotypical caricatured characters, and it has to work forward from there. I don't mean it has to, like that's the way it is and that's the way it should be. It just seems like that's the way Hollywood does things. What do you think of that?
It makes me think of like Woody Allen or the Jewish caricature
That
back
too.
in the day, and then now Jews are like overrepresented in media. And I'm not sure exactly how new that is. I don't think that's new, but yeah, maybe it kind of started as a caricature and now it's just ubiquitous, and there's all kinds of, because Jews don't have that problem anymore on TV, as what you guys are describing with these other minorities.
And that was an interesting one because many screenwriters and producers in Hollywood are, of course, Jewish. And there was a sort of self-censorship that they didn't want too much Jewish representation because they were almost worried that they would you know what I mean? Overrepresent because they were overrepresented within the administration of the entertainment, of Hollywood's entertainment industry. They didn't want that to, or something. There was some kind of sense of like, we need to be overcautious about Jewish representation in the media, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense too. Yeah. Because you don't want it to be like, then people can accuse you of using your position to like well, then it does look like the Jews really are taking over the world. So
hey, I think representation is just kind of nuts because in those ways, because I don't think you can ever get, like, if you're looking at it from demographics, like in the United States, the LGB is only 5% of the populace. So by representation, I should only 5% of all content should have LGB representation. Same as like for us Muslims, there's only 1%. So we should only be 1% of any content. You know, and you go from that, then you'd have the same thing though. Like these people who complain about too much white people. Well, then 76% of your populace is white. So 76% of all your content would be white.
Yeah.
Only 13% could be black.
But so I mean, is that how we should do it in representation? I mean, there would be some issues with that because in the country overall, you have those percentages, but since you have so many people, you would encounter more of those minorities than if you had the smaller sample in representation. Like 1% would be like one character, like one person.
Also remember, like, your region changes your viewpoints on this stuff. So it makes sense that somebody living in a city would think that America is very diverse and whatnot. But like if you go into other parts of the country, you may see just nothing more than a sea of white people. You know, it's kind of like going and living in Japan. You know, it's just like, oh well, you know, where's the other groups? You know, there is none. It's just that's how it goes. So I mean, I can see how people's, like, it's hard to say how representation should work I've always been of the mentality that people should just be writing stories. And if you want a story that's about, a certain group of people, write it, give a good, authentic story, have somebody tell their story. I don't think I think everything's being very ham-fisted right now. And I think being ham-fisted actually increases I'd say it increases resistance. Like when you portray the virtuous minority, it really makes people, kind of disgusted, because once you're always portrayed as the good people, and making it like anyone who has any criticism is immediately evil.
Yeah, and because it's not truthful, I think people grate against things that aren't true. But the representation in media is interesting. I think George Clooney put it best when he was put this question, that Hollywood really does have a sort of social responsibility. So there's an element of activism and social responsibility in there, sort of trying to overrepresent minorities, because there's a sense that minority groups need more representation right now so that people can come to understand them. So when you're a minority group, you might need, in the short term, some overrepresentation so people can learn about you and come to understand who you are, is sort of the idea. There's a lot that can be discussed about the merits of that, and whether that's a short-term thing as a sort of a very specific social justice project that has a sort of specific goals and therefore endpoints. Like, I don't think we should be living in a world where there's this constant overrepresentation of Muslims and gay people. But I can see that in the short term, when there's a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-gay sentiment, that maybe a little bit of overrepresentation and introduction of Muslim and gay characters to teach the populace at large about these groups makes sense. And I can be behind that. I'm still a social justice-y kind of guy, so I'm kind of fine with these kinds of things. But they do get tiresome and tedious really quickly,
Well, I would think, I'm a big fan of Lawrence of Arabia. Like, I have my twin cassettes.
So is Sasha.
You remember that? Yeah, definitely. We both like that movie.
Yeah.
But if I like it, I feel like that's like I'm a colonizer, because it's a movie, but it's like a white savior movie. So it's a little problematic to admit that I like it. But Nesim can admit it because he has the identity.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't mind it. I liked it. It was when I was younger, when I was watching it, I didn't feel anything was wrong with it. I mean, yeah, it's done from a point of view of where it's like this British guy comes in and he rallies this incoherent band of Arabs. But I didn't see anything wrong with it. I still don't see anything wrong with it, because what do you expect the movie's going to be about? How do you think people are going to tell a story in a country that is predominantly that type of people? I mean, I've watched Japanese movies. I mean, they will completely erase out people and just make everyone Japanese at times. So, I mean, everyone has their thing. I think sometimes we get a little too uptight about it. But I still don't think anything's wrong with it. I think people should watch these old movies just because, Lawrence
of Arabia doesn't have a single woman in it. So
no, it doesn't.
Not who gives a line, anyways.
Yeah.
There's one scene where the women are sending the men off to war, and they're like giving a war cry, and they're completely covered. You can't see them. That's the only females in the whole movie. It's funny because the movie also kind of has like a homoerotic subtext, which is what Arty and I were talking about last time we talked, because we were talking about how straight girls are attracted to gay men. And I was like, yeah, I used to really like Lawrence of Arabia, and I used to watch that over and over again. And those two guys had that really like homoerotic energy between them.
The Turkish scene, when he gets captured by the Turks, and they take him and ask what he is, and the guy's like sitting there touching him. They strip him and starts touching him. Like, you were wondering.
He was gay. T.E. Lawrence was gay.
Yeah.
And the whole Turkish event, a lot of historians thought that he just made that up. Like, completely just invented that whole scene that he wrote about, that he was captured by the Turks, and then they beat him and they kept him as a prisoner for a short time, and then he got away. But they think he invented that because it was almost like a fantasy of his. He was a very eccentric type of guy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Arty, have you seen the movie?
I'm trying to pretend that I have, but I actually haven't seen it since I was like a little kid and not all the way through. So
it's really.
But I'm very familiar with I know a lot about it, but I haven't actually seen it because it's really long.
It's really, yeah.
Yeah,
What is it, like
it
3
is
hours?
very intermission. It's 4 hour long movie, I believe.
But I have a big screen TV, high resolution,
Ooh.
so I should totally watch it.
That's the perfect type of thing to watch it on. Yeah, you should watch it. And then we'll have another discussion all about Lawrence Arabia. The influence of Lawrence.
And you can watch Call Me by Your Name, and we can talk about all these
Yes.
homoerotic movies.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't watched Call Me by Your Name, so.
Oh my gosh, you have to watch it. I
Okay.
could write essays about that movie.
Really?
Oh
How
yeah.
come?
Oh well, it's a gay love story, but it's so beautiful and so immersive, and it's just very, very deep observations about sort of your first love. And that's an interesting one about representation, actually. Brings us right back, because there was a lot of criticism of this movie. It's a gay love story, and it takes place in 1983, and there's no mention of AIDS, and nobody dies. And people were angry. People were like, how can you have a movie about gays and no one gets AIDS and dies? And I'm like, it's about fucking time we can just have a love story between two men where nobody gets AIDS and dies, you know, or gets gay bashed to death. Like every single gay love story, somebody has to have some tragedy revolving around the fact that they're gay. Because these are important stories to tell, but can't we just have a love story? And this movie is just that. It's a love story, and there's also no homophobia in the movie. It's almost like a fantasy of perfect love, because it's a love story between a young man and a slightly older student, and like everyone's supportive, and you know, they're very scared and they keep it secret, but people can kind of tell what's going on, and nobody tortures them, nobody beats them up, nobody mocks them, and it's just this like beautiful story. And that's one of the reasons I love it so much, because it's literally the only gay love story that is like that. You know,
Arty, did you see Portrait of a Lady on Fire?
No.
Oh, it was so good. It came out like 2 years ago, like right before coronavirus. And it was this lesbian love story, but it was kind of like that. They did face obstacles. It took place in like the 19th century or something, but it was just a really beautiful story, like really artistic and aesthetic and everything. And it was just a love story between them.
I love that.
So
There's
good,
another
yeah.
good one that has a positive ending. It's the movie Carol by Todd Haynes, who's a director I find really interesting. That's based on that book, The Price of Salt, by Patricia Highsmith, who also did, you know, Strangers on a Train and The Talented Mr. Ripley, these creepy psychological dramas that are very gay. But this is a lesbian love story. There's a lot of hardship that they endure, but it has a beautiful, happy ending. So yeah, more of that. It's so rare.
Yeah, those are fine. Like, just give us those. I remember in the beginning of It, the Stephen King movie. Oh,
yeah,
that's okay. There was just a gay bashing scene for no reason. I mean, it didn't play into the plot, and it was, I mean, the monster ended up killing the guy after some guys beat him up. But yeah, that was just so jarring, and it felt unnecessary. Like, it wasn't really showcasing it in the way, I mean, you did feel bad for him, of course. It wasn't like, oh, ha, ha. It wasn't set up like it was, the film was homophobic, but it just, to me, that just felt unnecessary. Like, that was just jarring to see right in the beginning, and then it's gone, and then the movie happens.
Yeah, it sounds like it's using it just to make you empathize with the character so that it can make it more powerful when the character gets killed or something.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah,
it feels like it
gets right into it, doesn't it?
It feels like at times that there's an over representation of victimhood within. Like, there's too much of an attempt to say, well, these people have been wronged, because I feel like that in and of itself is really corrosive. Like, you know, I know for myself, I don't really like to think about, like, yeah, it was rough growing up and all that stuff, but I really hate seeing Muslims portrayed always as like the victim of like some white person or of some form of racism, because many of us don't really experience it. Like, we can get away from it. It's not hard. I mean, especially now as we get more towards, you know, 2022. I mean, everything's been getting better, and yet more stuff is showing like, oh, well, you're having a hard time. Like, I was reading, I read Superman comics every once in a while because I just like the superhero genre. And there's a sequence where like Superman has to save a whole bunch of minorities from this like blonde, blue-eyed bad guy who's gonna rain bullets upon him. I'm just like, really? Like, does everyone have to be, does the perception of a minority has to be someone who is downtrodden and needs a white savior to actually uplift them? Because that's what it seems like it really is in the end of it.
It would be funny if he called the minorities too, Superman. I have to save the minorities. The minorities are in trouble.
Yeah, I can see that happening.
Yeah, that's how it's kind of done in today's. It's kind of like, I want something, if they're going to tell a story of, like, as you guys were talking about, just show an actual story about people. It doesn't need, I mean, I feel like you can tell a story about victimhood, but you don't have to do it in every single story, because it's got to be just jarring if that's your form of representation. That's got to be real jarring, at least to me. I think how. I feel like it just creates negative identity about it.
Many people are picking up on that. Two things. Like, well, I mean, there's a bit of a shift. It's like, at first we were fighting for representation. We were fighting for stories to be told, but now the culture has changed, and now we're very, very focused on correcting past injustices to the point that it's becoming impossible to just tell stories and treat people like people. But there were two recent examples of that trying to be addressed. One I thought was really funny was the movie 21 Jump Street. Remember the remake of that with Channing Tatum and I forget the other guy.
Is it Seth Rogen?
It's Seth Rogen, yes, that's right. And, the premise is that they're in their early 20s and they're like these shitty cops, and they're being made to go back to high school to pretend to be high school students because they have to break up some drug ring or something like that. And Channing Tatum's a big jock, right? And Seth Rogen's sort of, I don't even know, it might not have been Seth Rogen. It was someone else. But it was someone who's kind of sort of looks a bit stocky and nerdy. So they're preparing their personas to go into the new high school. And, Channing Tatum's expecting to be the cool jock, and the other guy's expecting to be the computer nerd. And they show up in school, and Channing Tatum sees like a black gay guy and cracks a joke. And he realizes instantly that he's suddenly tremendously unpopular because there's been a complete polar shift in high school dynamics, where to be a gay black guy is going to make you very popular in high school now. Whereas the tropes from the 80s movies in high school was like the jock was the cool guy. The pudgy guy was the nerdy guy who was really brainy, right? And gays and minorities were getting beat up and they weren't popular. And it's the exact opposite now in a lot of high schools, that the jock is totally unpopular in school. The nerd is extremely popular because he's so smart, and intelligence is valued now in high school culture in these liberal progressive cities. And it's all about how the tropes of what used to be seen as powerful and popular and what didn't have completely shifted. That was part of the whole movie, was talking about that. And high school subculture is a lot like a microcosm of culture in a lot of ways. So I thought that movie was really, really interesting because it was saying that, like, people who are considered minorities and oppressed can actually sometimes be in positions of power within certain circumstances and contexts, Yeah.
Oh, it's Jonah Hill.
Oh, it's Jonah Hill.
Yeah.
Oh, and another example is they tried to, the movie Heathers, another high school comedy?
I don't know that one.
Oh my gosh, Sasha. You have to see Heathers.
Okay,
it's an 80s movie. It's a black comedy. It's a high school comedy.
Okay.
It's one of my all-time favorite movies. Very, very quotable. It's about a woman who's like a girl. It's high school. Winona Ryder. She's somehow fallen in with the popular girls who are like really, really mean and really rich and pretty. And she's rich and pretty too, but she's intelligent and she's very, very sweet. And the popular girls are all named Heather. Heather Duke, Heather Chandler, and Heather whatever. And it's like a satire of high school culture. And the idea is she gets this boyfriend who's this badass, and it's Christian Slater. And he's a murderer, and he's killing off all the popular kids because they're mean. He kills the high school jocks and he frames them as gay lovers. He's killing off all the Heathers, and he makes them all look like suicides. So everybody thinks that all the popular kids have killed themselves because of all the hardships of pretending to be not gay when they're jocks, or pretending to be mean when they're really insecure. And you know what I mean? I won't spoil the rest of the movie, but you have to watch it. They tried to remake this movie recently as a TV series, and it was going to be such that the mean girls were actually the woke girls. And what they were doing to bully everyone was to take advantage of everybody's sort of liberal guilt. They were going to use like race and disability and sexual orientation and trans status as tools to manipulate people. And the show never made it to air because people were complaining.
Why.
I never saw it, but it was given to critics, and critics were like, liberal woke critics were like, it's not the right time for this. This is just mean, you know? And it never was made to air. And I think that's a shame, because I would have loved to see that. I would have loved to see people point out that this kind of sort of unthinking wokeness, this identity culture, can be so easily manipulated. And
yeah. Because look at who they came after first with that type of bullying. They came after the lesbians. I mean, that's what they did. They're like, lesbians aren't cool anymore. And that's exactly what they did. They used that manipulative, like, you have to feel really bad for the downtrodden transbians, the trans lesbians, and you have to accept them in your dating pool. That's exactly what they did with that.
That's right. And those downtrodden transbians, by and large, are upper middle class, straight white males who have a lot of issues that they need to work out. And some of them can be very sympathetic, but they're just sort of making all these demands. Yeah.
And that gets us to woke culture, which is very interesting, because I mean, it's almost like a complete reversal. I mean, it's interesting to grow up and see the liberals being all about having the very introspective content and all about criticizing society. And then when they gain as much power as they cannot bear any form of slight at all, anything like just a little bit of criticism, and it's just a bridge too far.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, I don't know what this, like, I really fear for cinema, because I mean, I don't see, like, with this whole woke stuff, I cannot see it producing anything that's like really palatable. I mean, can you? Because I mean, I feel like
no,
art
no,
and literature
it's not funny, it's not true. There's no real life. These are all caricatures. It's all ultra shallow and superficial. Yeah, you can't tell a real human story in the framework of wokeness. You can't even tell a story that people already don't know the ending to, you know, because it's always going to be, it's all calculated. You figure out who's going to live and who's going to die and who's good and who's bad based on you doing your virtue calculation, you know?
Everything's so sanitized, because you can't show any character that's a minority. You can't really show any flaw with them. So all of them have, I mean, a really good example of a movie or a movie series that was destroyed by its woke washing was the Star Wars movies that came out, because they wanted Daisy Ridley's characters to be such a badass that they turned her into a Mary Sue, where she was just too good at everything. They forgot that the whole idea of the rising hero is one who struggles, who has to find their way and then has to find that power, instead of they're just like, go and have it, and everything anything that is in your way, you'll just obliterate it. Well, no one enjoys that. That's the huge criticism of Superman. He's so powerful, there's nothing that can challenge him. Who wants to see that? In the story, it's like everyone, all this woke stuff, it's like as you said, you know the ending before the story's even told. And I mean, I feel like that stuff, it just does nothing but build tension. That's the thing that I noticed. Like, they go in trying to create this like inclusive experience, but you go out and you notice that people afterwards are just like, you know, disgusted more than anything.
So that's interesting that you mentioned Star Wars, because the director of The Last Jedi, which was, I think, the one that was most criticized for its wokeness, I liked the fact that it was sort of bringing in stuff like breaking all the tropes and bringing in lots of powerful women. I really liked The Last Jedi for that, for it smashing all the Star Wars tropes. The cocky pilot gets put in his place. He doesn't, you know, that kind of thing. The mean captain who we have to get around turns out to actually be good and noble, kind of thing. All sorts of cool stuff. I thought it was just going through all the tropes of Star Wars and breaking them. But that director, whose name I forget, is the same director of Knives Out. And he wrote Knives Out, Rian Johnson. And
I haven't
so,
seen that. What was that like, Knives Out?
oh, it's extraordinary. It's a wonderful, wonderful movie. It's it's an old-fashioned type of movie. It's one of these all-star ensemble casts. It's a murder mystery in a big mansion, you know? Very classic old school kind of movie, but he put a really modern twist on it. But throughout the movie, there's lots of talk about woke culture. You know, there's lots of jokes about like, where did you graduate from? SJW University, that kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
So it's interesting that he was criticized for being a bit wokey pokey in his Star Wars. And then the next movie he made, I thought it balanced really well, like conservatives and liberals, and they're both extremes and hypocrisies. I saw that movie in the theater, and then the ending, when everybody came out of the theater, I've never seen everyone so happy before. That was just a profoundly satisfying movie experience. Everybody was just like, that ending was amazing. The murder twists were amazing. And everybody came out of that theater just being like, yay, beaming with happiness. And I just thought, that is so cool, you know? So when you are honest and true, and when you do go at woke culture and sort of address it, instead of just trying to be virtuous, people relax and people enjoy themselves. Right. Yeah.
I think in the Star Wars, just to get this in and out as fast as possible, I think in the Star Wars, the problem was they were trying to do too much. They had way too many characters. They're trying to devote way too much time to it. And they're trying to make each character significant. And I don't think in a story you can really give equal representation to all your characters. You have to pick who's the focus and who's not and run with it. Because when you have too many characters, it feels like you're just doing way too much. You're going to have a lot of people who just don't care.
Well, and the other thing that you reminded me of with that is the whole representation of women in movies and TV as super strong, where they can beat up men all the time. I mean, one of my favorite show is The Americans. And like, you have this amazing character, Elizabeth, who's a Russian spy, and she kicks everybody's ass, and she's like super tough and strong, but it is unrealistic. I mean, and then now has that led to people getting confused about sports and why women need their own sports and everything, because we've lost the like communal understanding that women just simply do have the physical disadvantage to men, because that's become insulting now almost to say in certain circles.
I hate to say this, but it seems like in many ways media does educate people, because you're getting people who ask questions like, can women and men fight one another? Like, no. I mean, you go to any gym or whatnot, I'll never forget, you can see it's a YouTube of a female black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. She's talking to her class and she's like, okay, we're gonna be grappling with the men. Remember, it is a different experience. It is a very different experience. And, you know, the guys are going to be worried about hurting you during this. Because, I mean, I've seen it. I've seen a woman, a black belt. I mean, this was happening in class. A black belt instructor is going at it with a blue belt. They're actually just going at it, seeing, you know, who's better. The male just destroyed her. She couldn't do anything. You know, she's the more skilled one, but, you know, once you take the physical advantage into the equation, and then you take in the fact that if he knows the submissions, he can just control her, and there's nothing she can do on that. It just flattens her. I mean, Rogan was not wrong when he says when you have a high-level female athlete versus in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or whatnot versus a mid-level male athlete that's not even near her caliber, he can still crush her. There's no way around it. And the fact that people have forgotten this is kind of jarring, because then it really begs the question, how long till people are like, yeah, a man's yelling at a woman, it starts to get, you know, kind of it gets heated. How long till somebody goes, no, you know, if they fight, whatever, she should be able to hold her own. Like, no, she's not. This is not. The guy needs to know not to do that, and everyone needs to be like, no. But I mean, I feel like that's coming eventually, because I mean, it seems like people are really forgetting that the male has the physical advantage, and it seems like media has played into that with the fighting strong woman who can kick everyone's ass, and it seems like people are taking that way too literally.
Well, isn't it sort of like the women's spaces thing and women's sports thing? Like, exactly. If you're saying that women are just as strong as men, then you're going to undermine the protections that are there for the fact that that's not true. You know?
Yeah.
Right.
But that's interesting about like the sort of strong woman trope in media. I guess maybe it's a thing where like when there weren't any strong women in media, we were desperate for them.
Mhm.
And then now that's all we're getting. It's gone the
and
other
it's
way.
exaggerated.
Like, yeah, like Ellen Ripley, still my favorite movie character. I fucking love Aliens and Alien, you know?
Mhm.
Those are like, the rest of them don't exist as far as I'm concerned. But those first two are extraordinary movies. And I love Linda Hamilton in Terminator 2 and Terminator 1, which is just called Terminator. But
I'm trying to get the Netflix documentary that I watched. They talked about how as we've gotten more inclusive or more liberal in our movies, the female characters have become more and more one-dimensional, whereas beforehand the female characters had, were multifaceted. The mother could also be a vixen. She could also be socially strong. Now it's like, pick your poison. What is she? Is she like the victim who her husband, browbeats, and she needs to go find some man who will elevate her? Or is she like this really strong, badass woman who you just get butt shots every like few seconds? Like it seems like there's no in between there. They've been rendered into one thing and one thing only.
No nuance. Isn't that like intersectionalism? Like the point of intersectionalism at first was to say, let's look at nuance. Let's see how different aspects of identity can intersect and interact, right? And change things, which was really a call for nuance and looking at the bigger picture. But it ended up, of course, doing the opposite. It reduced the picture, and we ended up with the Oppression Olympics, where you're just looking at different points of different sort of identity matrix aspects or something, and you're just counting them up. Right?
Now, would that go into like, I feel like that comes down to the left's like want to like sanitize pain out of human existence. Do you know what I mean? Like it looks like, as we were talking about how everything is getting like less and less truth, it's like everything is about sanitizing the ugliness out of a story. Because I read, I forget the author or whatnot, but someone got angry over a book that was written because one of the villains was a racist, so there were racial epithets thrown in the book. And it's like, well, I mean, if the bad guy's a racist and they're going to take him down, wouldn't you expect to hear ugly, brutal language? Mm-hmm. And shouldn't you want to, hear that or see that? Because I mean, if you're representing a ugly thing, don't you want to represent it? Don't you want people to see what it actually looks like?
Well, it's like people keep getting in trouble for saying the N-word when they're reading Mark Twain. Like teachers keep getting in trouble for this. And people want to censor Mark Twain, which is about racism and about slavery and showing the dehumanization and the othering and the differences between these two boys because one is Black and one is white. So that is like, people can't handle the unpleasantness of hearing that. So they're just shutting down the whole story.
That's right. It's so strange. And these aren't true stories. Story itself is supposed to be writing, prose. Literature is about the depth of human experience, right? Recording it and understanding it and coming to a deeper understanding of what it is to be a human. And woke storytelling and like the phenomenon of what's going on in YA literature, which is just constant virtue signaling. And it's just, that's not getting us anywhere in terms of understanding the human experience. We're erasing the human experience. I think you're quite right when you say that it's like we're trying to erase pain, and you can't do that. That's another beautiful thing about Call Me by Your Name. It's not about the suffering of homosexuals at the hands of big, bad, mean heterosexuals, but it's about the pain of love and heartbreak when a romance ends. So it's a deeply sad ending of a movie, not to spoil it. I've never cried so much in my life at that movie. But it wasn't like, yeah, it wasn't like this like objectifying us as like tragic in any way, you know, and it was a universal love story that anyone can appreciate, straight or gay, you know, male or female.
That was like Portrait of a Lady on Fire. It was really sad because they had, you know, troubles in love, like in their relationship and being able to be with each other. But it was complex. Like it showed their pain. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful universal story. So maybe there is some hope here because these movies both just came out. So this is good. This is a good sign, actually.
Maybe
that
there's some
wokeism
balance
hasn't
there.
totally taken over. Say that
We
again.
went from no representation. Maybe it is a phase that we have to go through with this sort of uncomfortable, cartoonish over-representation. Maybe that's a sort of a phase that Hollywood has to go through before it can become comfortable. Just having, you know, these kinds of characters, having a diverse array of people. I find it interesting that Canada's way ahead of the curve on that. Our TV shows and movies have just naturally represented cultural, ethnic, sexual diversity and played it really well. And I think even Canada's sliding back and getting a little bit tokeny when it just always was really good. You know, Toronto's a deeply diverse city. It's the most ethnically diverse city in the world. And we had a show that's been around since the early 80s. It started out called The Kids of Degrassi Street. And then it became something called Degrassi Junior High. And then Degrassi High. And then they rebooted it with Drake later. And then I think it got a little bit. Right. But it's actually been around since the 80s. Okay. I haven't seen the one with Drake, but which probably was all wokey pokey. But in the 80s and 90s, this show had characters of all ethnic backgrounds and nobody made any deal out of it, you know? And in our television, like news reporting, we have a lot of newscasters and weather people and journalists who have very unusual names, for example, who all come from different countries, and there's nothing sanitized about it. This is real diversity, you know?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that kind of just reminded me was that Nesim and I have talked about in our episode on white privilege is that, well, actually, no, we talked about it in our big tech episode, that the woke people's rhetoric around whiteness is really similar to actually white supremacist rhetoric in that they want to draw attention to it. They want it to be like one of the most important parts of your identity, because Robin DiAngelo will say things like, it took me years to get people to see my whiteness and see what was meaningful about that. And then who was it, Nasim? Richard Spencer, who's basically saying he loves critical race theory? Yeah,
he said he loved it. He said that anything that starts getting people talking about race is a good thing. And in this case, you know, when you're talking about the white race and whatnot, stigmatizing it is not a bad thing to a racist, because it's going to cause people to want that conversation, and that brings them into the equation. Like, that's why, like, for me, I do, to a degree, like, I do like a bit of an invisibility, because I feel like the more people obsess about like these characteristics and whatnot, the more it brings out the ugly side, because human beings seem to have a want to categorize each other. And once they do that, it's then, okay, you're not like me, we're different. Okay, so what are we going to do with you? And then the questions start coming about. And so it's like, okay, well, you know, why don't we avoid that? Because I don't really know if we will ever have a period of time where we don't have some form of bigotry. Do you know what I mean? Because, I mean, you can make the popular, like, how can you, if you're dividing everyone up and saying, hey, see each other as different, how can you have any sort of cohesion? Because once people see each other as different, they start seeing, oh, do we have the same interests? And if the answer is no, then where do you go from there? Like,
yeah, I mean, they're literally saying that poor whites and poor blacks have completely different interests. They're saying they're saying the white people have an interest in keeping the black people down. So they're completely setting them up to be opposed like that.
Well, let me bring up something like early on in the super movement, you know, the super straight thing that happened. One of the things that was interesting when I went on to this Discord that all the super straight people were congregating to was that there were different types of people on there, and some of them were very racist. Okay, and I got to have a conversation with an Italian racist. Okay, a guy in Italy that comes from Italy, living in the UK and whatnot. And people's jaw were just to the floor because he didn't view English. He viewed English as subhuman people. Like he viewed them as but he viewed them as subhuman people, and we were sitting there talking about this, and people were really, really surprised that from race came the ethnic difference. Like, if you think about it, Italians, all these European people, there's very little difference in them in that, in skin color, that is. Like in America, being white is all about your skin color. It's not really about your ethnic heritage. But when you go into Europe, that's completely gone. The ethnic heritage matters. And so they break each other down by that level.
Well, it's nationalism. Europe has a nationalist history. Yeah.
Yeah. And he was basically like, when we were talking about it, he was like, look, I'm Italian. He's like, I love my people. And if you're not my people, then you're not me. And I don't want to deal with you. I don't care about you. You can go. And so I'm sitting there thinking, okay, so if you get to that level, even if you were able to erase the concept of race, people are going to grasp onto some sort of difference that they can and say, because of this difference, I'm better than you. I mean, he even told me, he's like, I really like talking to you. You're really cool and all that. And he's like, well, he's like, but I'll give you an example. If you lived in my country and I had my way, I'd give you money to leave. But if you're not willing to leave, we both know what's going to happen there. I mean, that was the level of how it was. It was an interesting conversation to have with this individual. I mean, he was an incredible racist. We eventually kicked him off the server just because of that. But I mean, to really hear someone enunciate that to that level and get to it, and then see how comical racists are portrayed in the media. Like, I don't think people are going to even be able to recognize what racism and bigotry really looks like until it's over, because these people are getting the race questions that they want to be talked about in the society with like critical race theory and all that. How long till more of those guys rise up and say, yeah, I should be proud. Everyone's saying I should be ashamed of myself. Oh no, I'm proud. I love my whiteness. Then what do we do? What do we do when that becomes the counterculture?
Well, that's already happening, but it's really weird because when there's moves to ban critical race theory being taught in schools. I think it's Florida that's pushed something. And that move was obviously a move by people who are, I would argue, probably white supremacists or at least racists,
Yeah.
So it's
and it's also an infringement on free speech. It's like, we don't want to do that. We don't want to fight fire with fire. We have to still allow all ideas to circulate. I mean, I can't really decide whether it should be taught in school or not. I'm not sure, but definitely I wouldn't support suppressing something just because I disagreed with it.
Well, it's also a question of what exactly is defined as critical race theory. We're and we're also talking about when do we can't just be colorblind. We can't say race doesn't matter. We should be pointing out, we have to talk about race and racial difference. And to address the fact that in the United States, I certainly believe that systemic racism exists in the sense that the structures of the United States and other parts of the world too, Canada too, but I think especially for Black people and Latin American people in the United States, it's just systemically more difficult for them in a lot of ways. And we have to be able to talk about that. But when do we talk about it too much? You said a word earlier, Nesim, you said obsess. And I think that was exactly the right word. When do we go from talking about it to obsessing over it? Where's that line? We've gone the wrong way. We've gone from nobody's talking about it at all, and we want to talk about this stuff, to like, now we're obsessing over it. It's like, we need to find the balance. And the question becomes, is critical race theory inherently causing people to obsess, or is it just the kinds of people who are in these fields? Are they is critical race theory a benign tool for looking at it, or is it structurally problematic in and of itself? Is it just the kinds of people who get into critical race theory tend to be obsessive.
I think it's a thing. I am actually against it being taught in schools for one reason, and that is the way it assigns, like, it doesn't talk about like, okay, there are racial issues and whatnot. No, it talks about there are racial issues, and then it talks about like how the maligned, the victims, are powerless, and thus the more powerful people have to, learn how to behave in a certain way and treat these members, who, no matter who they are, as if they're racial avatars. And I think that's a very dangerous thing, because like, there's one thing I remember.
What do you mean by racial avatars?
Okay, so like, if somebody's like listening to me talk, I'm Arab. Does that mean I speak for all Arabs? Do I, when somebody addresses me, are they going to address me as who I am, or are they going to address me as an Arab and see me as only a member of my quote unquote tribe? Because if that's the case, then me as a person doesn't matter. Okay. And also, that also means that what I do reflects on the community that I'm from, which means that if I do bad, that means all Arabs do bad. And that's something that, you want to get away from, because any form of collective, the idea of like collective guilt, well, they'll just lead us straight to, we've seen what collective stuff does. We have World War II and Bosnia to give us a great example of that. Like I really get concerned about things like when people bring up the past and like the sins of the past, and talk about reparations and how white people need to, be held accountable for their racist past. I'm sitting there thinking, I've read that before. Because in the whole of the Bosnian genocide, the Serbians constantly talked about how the Ottomans brutalized the Serbians, and the way the Serbians looked at it. The Bosnians, they didn't never. If you looked at how, like in their media and all that during that time, how they talked about the Bosnians, they referred to them as Turks. Didn't even, these are Slavic people they're about to kill, and they refer to them as Turks, completely saying that these people don't belong here. They're Turks. They're the ones that 600 years ago made us serfs for their empire. So that gave these people the right to then round up their men, shoot them, and then rape their women and do all these horrible things. And I don't think human beings know nuance. I think whenever you go and have that, well, you're responsible for what happened in the past, the eventuality is something's going to go and become really ugly. And I think in this case, the more like, as I said, there's always a form of bigotry and whatnot. Back when the recession hit in 2009, you could really see all of the anti-Muslim thought coalescing and the attitudes really hardening. Like in my own state, you could see, like, I remember when 9/11 happened, there was interest in what was Muslims and Arabs and all that. But by 2009, when the economy was crashing, people who wanted scapegoats were then looking at, oh, well, this stuff too, these people and all that stuff, it hardens attitudes. And I just, it makes my skin crawl, because I mean, little history. The reason why I obsess about Bosnia is when I was young, one, we had a lot of Bosnian immigrants from the war. And two, when I started working, I worked at a place called Amir Rug Exchange. And one of my friends there, he became my friend. He's this Bosnian guy. We were talking, and he told me about how, because I asked him about his family and how his mom and his dad was. I didn't know his dad wasn't there. And he told me the story of how why his dad's not there. The Serbs came to their home, got the father, and that was it. The last words he said was, "Everything's going to be all right." That's the thing I always remember him saying to me. My father said, "Everything's going to be all right." Never saw his father since. So those things like always are on my mind when it comes to that, because this stuff kind of it really like the whole critical race thing and whatnot really follows along with the logic of everything the Serbians were saying about the Bosnians. You just don't have anyone come out saying, well, we're better and we have the right to kill these people. That's just what we don't have yet. I mean, the case of reparations and all the stuff that I'm seeing, I can see some racist right winger one day raising up and saying, see, we talk about inclusion, we talk about this, and these people want us to live on our knees. We can't live together. Why are we? And that's what I think I fear more than anything, because there's definitely a want in America, at least there's definitely racists and whatnot that want a conflict between all the races. They want there's a concept in America by the white racists called RAHOA, the racial holy war, and they began rebranding back in about 2006 to where it's like, we will not outwardly be racist. We will garb everything we say in the flag, but we won't be outwardly racist. So instead of going and protesting and having guys on bullhorns saying, racial epithets, now they're just saying USA, we're here for this and all that. And all of what's going on, I think, is just going to make this more like Europe, where the racists get more and more savvy with their language.
The backlash.
Yeah.
The right-wing backlash against all this. How do you see that, Arty?
The only way through this is, how do we teach people to be more nuanced? Because you said something about how you don't want to be seen as just Arab, but I think we wouldn't want to not see that you're Arab, but that's a factor in who you are as well, right? So it's like, we have to acknowledge your Arabness. That's an important part of you and who you are. And we could fall into that word, your identity. Like I said at the beginning of this, an identity is a story we tell about ourselves. Let's talk about you as a person instead of making up a story, right? And relying on tropes.
It kind of is sad too, because it kind of like, I'm viewed as Arab, but it's kind of erasing my mom out of the equation because my mom's English descent. So
there you go. Your identity isn't just Arab, is it? You're a human being and not just a series of you're not just a Minecraft bunch of blocks you put together with a bunch of prefabricated stories, right?
Yeah, and that's like one of the things is like, because I'm used to, when I go into any group, certain groups will sit there and say, you're white like us, or certain groups will be like, okay, you're Arab. No one really sees like, okay, well, I'm technically mixed at that point. So what am I in this? It seems like no one ever grasps that. Because that's one thing I see with all this stuff. Especially see it with people who are mixed with black and white, and how they're only treated as black. And for me, I think like, if we're having any nuance, if you can't define someone, if you can only define somebody by one half, then what does that mean?
I mean, it's like in Nazi Germany, they had all these rules to figure out who's Jewish enough to be, considered a Jew. I mean, they had like all these rules about how many drops of blood you could have and stuff. So when you start parsing those things, because you can't have nuance, you have to put someone in the group or out of the group. It can be dangerous.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, if we want to break for a minute, Arty, if you want to get your wine or whatever, we've been going for about an hour, so we could come back. We can take a minute and come back.
I'm just going to grab some wine real quick. I'll be right back.
Okay.
I'll read my mind, Sasha.
Good.
I'm like, I could really go for some wine right now.
We're getting into the serious stuff now.
Exactly. So I hope you guys enjoyed that episode with Arty Morty. That was the first half of our discussion with him. And if you want to see the second half, which got a little bit spicy, we talked about a lot of different things: feminism, critical race theory, the Iraq War. If you want to see all that, you can head on over to the Plebity Patreon page, where you can join for the different tiers. They're all access to the same content. You'll be able to see the second half of this interview and other exclusive content, and you'll know that your money is going to a good cause, because it's going to the Free Speech Fund, which is used to support people who've been punished for their speech. And our most recent recipient was Raquel Rosario Sanchez. If you don't know her story,
briefly, she is suing University of Bristol, England, because they failed to protect her from bullying by trans activists for being a feminist. So head on over to our Patreon page. We have a lot of good stuff. Check it out. Finish the interview with Arty Morty. And yeah.
Also, like and subscribe, and also hit the little notification bell. We'll have episodes every Wednesday.